Okay, I think we can get started, and people can always join later. It's okay. So we're not keep people waiting here. And first of all, thank you very much for joining us tonight for Artist Talk by Harold Wortsman. My name is Ajuan Song, Director of Orange Art Foundation. It is my honor to be the moderator of tonight's talk. After talk, we will have a Q&A session. So if anyone have any questions to Harold, we can do it at that time. A little about the artist. I think some people already know him, but I will just give a little brief background. Harold Wortsman is a sculptor and printmaker based in Brooklyn, New York. He graduated from Brandeis University with honor in sculpture and the New York Studio Schools of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture. So Harold, could you please give us a walkthrough of this exhibition?
Sure, it will be my pleasure. First, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the Orange Art Foundation for hosting this exhibition. It's great, and for hosting this talk. Now, I hope the gods of the internet don't cause us trouble, but Ajuan, let me know if you suddenly lose me or if you can't hear me.
Okay.
So thank you to everyone who's joining us here and for those who will join us as we proceed. As I was thinking about this, I thought that I would begin by a quote from Matisse, that the first thing an artist has to do is cut out their tongue. And much of the art that I adore is the art of the past, and we don't know who made it. We have no idea who they were. But since I am here and you are here, I guess it's all right for me not to cut out my tongue and to speak. So we will go through the exhibition. The first piece that we're looking at is Cube, Pyramid, and Sphere. It's a pretty large piece. It's from around 2017. It's about 6 feet by 6 feet by 4 feet. It's a composite work. It started out, it was created over a several-year period, and it came together in 2017 when I was given the opportunity to show the work in Industry City in Brooklyn. It basically is a cube, a pyramid, and a sphere. Those are the building blocks of form. I, for whatever reason, made those pieces over a several-year period using the techniques that I use, which I'll talk about later. And then the piece itself is a synthesis. It also consists of that green block of wood, which I was at Fort Tilden many years ago with a Swiss painter and a German art historian, and we found that floating in the water in the ocean. And eventually I brought it back to my studio. And some of the other stones are river stones from the memorial of a friend. They were stones at the river where we threw his ashes. So all of these things came together when I was given the opportunity to make this piece. And that's it, cube, pyramid, and sphere. The next piece is called Altar. It is fired clay. All of the work, much of the work here is fired clay, and I'll talk a little bit about the technique later. But this piece, it was originally intended to house objects, but sculptural objects. But then as I was making it, I realized that it didn't need anything and was quite fine as it is. It's somewhat geometric because I often work with geometry, but it's an irregular geometry. If you look at from above, there is geometry, but it's irregular. The forms are felt rather than imposed, and that interests me very much. Let's move to the next piece. Adjuan, we can go to the next one, to balance. Now, this is a quite recent piece. It was fired last summer. It's balance. If you want to come down a little bit, perfect. And here I'll talk a little bit about the technique that I use. My work is generally abstract, but I don't like to differentiate between abstraction and naturalism. My temperament is abstract, but hopefully much of the work derives from the real world, and hopefully, whatever that means, the real world, and hopefully it has reference to the real world and moves people in that direction. The piece is out of clay. It's carved, you can see. It started out as a relatively straightforward form. Then I remember flipping it around, then carving into it, hacking into it. It's a two-step process. The piece is first made just with clay. I don't think of color. Then I apply minerals. They're called oxides. I don't like glaze. For me, glaze is like a shirt, whereas oxides are like a watercolor or a tattoo. And I fire in a wonderful gas kiln from Third Avenue Clay, run by a wonderful person named Adrian Yorick. Let's proceed. The next piece. This piece is called Block Monument. The technique is the same. The type of firing that I do in a gas kiln is called reduction. The heat is raised. These pieces are all fired to 2,300 degrees, which is very, very hot. Once they come out of the kiln, they're not going to change. They are the way they are. And the nature of reduction is you raise the temperature up to a certain point, and then you reduce oxygen. But the fire is so hot that instead of going, if you could turn off your sound, whoever that is. So as I was saying, the fire is raised to a certain point, and then
we log in from my thing.
Yeah.
Somebody could please turn off their sound, because I'm hearing you. It interferes. Anyhow, so the fire is raised to a certain temperature, then oxygen is reduced, but instead of going out, it takes oxygen from the clay and from the minerals, and that's very interesting. It's like a jazz improvisation. Every kill load is slightly different. Now, I often stand on a ladder when I work, and I look down. So if you notice the photo on the right of the three, you can see the top of the piece. That's often how I look down on things, to really feel the form. Okay, we can move on to the next.
Oh.
This piece is called Landscape. It utilizes the techniques that I've talked about. I like limestone very much, and I like mixing limestone with clay, and that's what this piece does. It also is on feet. Sometimes I raise pieces to allow the space to go underneath. When I was working on this piece, it reminded me a little bit of the Ryanji garden in Kyoto. It wasn't that the Ryanji, that I did it with the Ryanji garden in mind, but rather as I was working, Ryanji came to mind. We can move on. We could go to the next piece. This piece is Can you hear me? Adjuan?
Yes, we can hear you.
Adjuan?
Yes.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, great. Great. So, yeah, great. Perfect. This piece is called Monument, and it's very much about a kind of exploration with space. At the same time, it did remind me of a cemetery. It was technically kind of hard to do because these pieces, if as it is now, everything, the verticals would all melt in the heat. They would not stay vertical. So it was quite a challenge to create the pieces separately and then glue them together. Sometimes that happens. We can move on to the next.
Okay. Woo.
This piece is called Palace. It's one piece, it's several slabs of clay welded together. You can see the beige clay is what the natural clay looks like without minerals applied. The brown iron is basically red iron. And here you can see, especially in the image on the left, how the surface of the clay is revealed. With glaze, that wouldn't work. It would be all covered up and shiny. And that's a reason that I don't use glaze. This piece could be much larger. If I were ever to create it on a massive scale, I would probably use Corten steel and cement. And that's about it. This work is entitled Red, Black, and Brown. It's quite recent. Here you can see the different textures that I use. On the right, there are these textured areas. I use texture as a color. I don't use it for decorative purposes. I'm not interested in decoration, but I use it for color masses, almost to create like a different blue or a different green. But instead of a color, it's a texture that speaks as a color. And I like the black spikes going through the piece. There's a certain violence about it, but also spatially, it's interesting how the black moves through the brown. Okay. Now, the next series of pieces were created during COVID lockdown. They're 10 vertical pieces. They were made for a firing technique called anagama. It is a wood-fired kiln that fires for about 5 days and then takes another week and a half to cool. I was lucky enough to have access to a kiln upstate at Salem Artworks run by Jordan Becker. It's a wonderful kiln. And these pieces, no minerals have been applied. The color is exclusively applied by the fire. It's all the same clay. Now, I knew this when I was making the pieces, so there was some attempt to utilize the fire, but it seems to have worked out quite well. Let's go down a little bit. On the piece on the left, you can actually see the tongue of fire, the brown, literally the brown tongue of fire. And the color on each piece is slightly different. Now on the right, it's due to the way I've textured it, how one side, I often use stone tools. I let the clay get quite hard, and then I use a limestone hammer, the kind of hammer that's normally used on limestone to get that texture on the right-hand side. But then when the fire of the kiln met the texture, it did very, very interesting things. So there is a degree of controlled randomness, especially in the wood firing. And the trick is to use that and to run with it. Okay, we can move on. Now, this is the beginning of the reliefs. I do many, many reliefs. I love the relief as a form. I'm not sure why. The techniques I employ are the same in terms of first working purely spatially, then low firing, then adding minerals for the second firing. This piece on the left, Paris Reverie, some years ago, I'd spent a chunk of time in Paris and I came back to my studio, and to my surprise, the piece came together relatively quickly. And then later, color was applied. The piece is 3 feet high by about little less than 2 feet wide. I'm hearing some talk in the background. Please turn off your sound. The piece it's one piece, but it's clearly composed of two, and that was part of the intent. On the left, you can see that it's seamless, but on the right, the two pieces are irregular, and I wanted that irregularity, the irregularity in the context of the whole. Now let's enlarge the piece on the right a little if we can. Great. This is a pretty recent piece. It's called Dream. Here, very much you can see the way I play with textures. The little speckles around that central black mass, it's something called grog. Most people use grog in clay to add strength, but I use it as a decorative element, like a color. And I'll tell you a word now about titles. I very rarely think of a title before the fact, but occasionally while I'm working on a piece, a title will come, but usually once the piece is done, a title will suggest itself. In this case, the title was Dream. We can move on. A whole cycle of pieces that I do are black. I call them black and white reliefs. It's a slightly different technique. I use minerals called engobes. They're colored slips. In this case, they're white and black. They're applied like paint. Then I carve out the piece and then I fire it. So the technique is different. And this is a whole series that I've done over the last 10 years. I generally do 1 to 2 a year. These two pieces are from that series. The one is called Mathematical Theorem, and the other is called Time Map 2. Time Map 2 is very recent. It was completed this past summer, in this past summer's firing. Again, this is a technique of applying two different colored slip, like paint, and then carving into the clay and creating an image, which in some ways is almost print-like. I think we can move on. The next 3 pieces are paintings on clay. My approach to clay is no different than a painter approaches the canvas or a sculptor who works in stone approaches stone. I work with clay, with space, and clay becomes the vehicle for that. These next 3 pieces, these paintings on clay, are just that, slabs of clay, which has been fired. On the left, it's porcelain. Lately, I've been playing around with porcelain. It's very white. And then I apply cobalt carbonate, which is one of my main minerals. And when it is fired on the porcelain, it turns midnight blue. and hence the title Midnight Blue. But it is a drawing on clay or a painting using the mineral. Now, Adjuan, everything good sound-wise? You can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Now, Yellow Forest is the same type of technique, just using different minerals as paint, but fired to 2,300 degrees, which is the temperature that I fire at. Let us move on. And this last piece, it starts out as a slab of clay. In fact, you see that the one side is irregular. One summer, I rolled out maybe 5 different slabs of clay. And when I fired them, they broke in half. So initially I was upset, but then I realized that the irregularity was quite interesting, was perhaps more interesting than my original intent. That often happens. Intent is an enemy, and one always needs to fight intent. So this piece was created like the others, a painting on clay. It was done this summer in the firing. And then when I took it out, I realized that it was in fact a nightmare, hence the title. Okay, let us move on. Now I do a lot of printmaking. Later, I'll talk about how I got into printmaking. But the technique I use is I use aluminum flashing, which I buy in Home Depot. I buy rolls of aluminum. They're about 2 or 3 feet wide and 20 feet long. And then I cut out pieces as I need them. And the plates really look like 2-dimensional metal sculptures. And one day it will be very interesting to do an exhibition of the plates versus the prints. So I make the plates working purely spatially, the same way I initially approached clay. And then I go to my printmaker. Initially, I worked with Shayla Goloborotko. Now I work with Kathy Caraccio, a wonderful printmaker in Manhattan. And I improvise with color. And the color is applied to the metal. And these are the results. These prints are pretty large. They're 2 feet by 3 feet. The first piece on the left, Labyrinth, is a monotype, which means that I was applying color with the intent of never being able to reproduce it. The other followings, the Owl Rock and the one below, I would be able to reproduce them. But none of these are reproduced more than editions of 3. It's just way too time consuming. I used to do quite a lot of graphic design. Many artists teach, but I chose not to. Instead, I became something of a graphic designer. And one day in the morning, I was on a giant Heidelberg printing 10,000 impressions an hour. And then in the afternoon, I was working in my printmaker studio in Red Hook, printing, I think it was Cave, and it took us 3 hours to get one print. The inking is too time consuming, but that's part of what it's all about. So that's about it. I hope you've all enjoyed the walkthrough.
Great. I think it's to get people to know about your work, and I hope would like to know a little bit about you and how you do the works. So could you tell us like when and how you start to make art?
Sure. I started art when I was 5 years old, but I didn't know it was art. For the longest time, I didn't know it was art. I didn't know what art was. I and my brother played in clay. We made all of our soldiers in clay. and all of the childhood fantasies were visited on the childhood heroes. They would be tormented and all the suffer their end and then be resurrected, on and on and on. And this went on for some years. Then there was a short period where somehow I couldn't touch clay. I'm not sure why. And then I think in high school, it returned, and I returned to clay. I took my first sculpture course with a man named Chaim Gross from New York. He was well known at a certain point. He's long gone. And then when I went to college, I got serious about it, and decided that that's what I was going to do for the rest of my life.
Mhm. So you graduated from Brandale University with honor in sculpture, and also in New York Studio Schools of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture. Can you tell us what you think is the best you've learned from the art school?
Yeah, well, I have a mixed feeling about art education. I'm not sure if it has any value at all, really. Certainly the whole current MFA art industrial complex is not for me, and not something that I aspire to. And as I said before, I went to Brandeis, and I knew that I would never teach. That teaching works for many people, but for me, I knew it would not work.
Mhm.
I went then when I finished college, I was a finished artist. I knew everything. I started to exhibit and I started to sell at the end of college. And then I realized that I just could not continue doing that, that it would be a dead end. And that's why I went to the studio school. My teacher in college, Peter Grippy, had associations with the studio school. And it's because of him that I went there. And I went there with the attempt of becoming an idiot, completely destroying whatever it was that I thought about art and trying to clarify my vision. And I did that for 3 years, and it was a very odd time. And the whole studio school experience was difficult, and it took me many years to recover from it. But I think that ultimately all art education is self-education, and that every artist educates themselves one way or another, whether it be through school or just through working and living.
Interesting. So if you feel the art school is not the way to really learn art, so
Well,
what is is there anything else like particularly help you or influence you in you and your art?
well, I don't want to say that art school is not the way. I'm not sure. It may be for some people, and it did serve something of a useful purpose for me in forcing me to investigate the plastic language, the language of plasticity, which is very important to me. But again, maybe art school is good, maybe it's not. I don't know. In terms of if you're asking about particular influences that have influenced me, it's really all of the art that has come before up till this moment, and all of the art that moves me. Composer has a line, if it's philosophy of art, if it moves me, it moves me. I don't care who made it. I don't care about the intent. I don't care about the meaning, if it's famous or not famous. If something moves me, it moves me. And that's sort of driven my self-education, beginning with Egyptian art and African art, oceanic art. And these are all things that I adore. Art of the Romanesque, the Etruscans. This is all amazing, great stuff. The cave painters in the 20th century, so many great artists, whether it be Matisse, Giacometti, Julio Gonzalez, the great welder who taught Picasso how to weld. There is a painter, a German painter Bissier, Julius Bissier, who died in the 1960s, who has been a very important influence on me, even though I never met any of these people. Chillida, Eduardo Chillida, the Basque sculptor, just so many things. The other day I was in the Brooklyn Museum for the first time in quite a few years, and I was in their Egyptian collection, and there was a little goddess 5,000 years old out of clay, great, great piece of sculpture. So I think everything that I look at, that I think it's with all artists. We look at things, what we read, what we see, even what we eat and breathe.
Great. I couldn't agree with you more. It's
Thank you.
yeah, it's a great, I think we're living in a world, everything surrounding us could be part of inspirations. It just depends on people. Some people take it into inspiration and convert something or somebody, other people and appreciate as a pure beauty or something else. That's all great.
Right. I think, though, the key for me, at least, is to distill these things. I'm not interested in direct referential work, whether it be to a culture or a piece. It's more these things get distilled over time, digested, and then they become something else.
Great. So I was, hear you talking about the pieces in these exhibitions, and I was curious about your working process. Could you telling us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Let's look at, we can look at balance, for instance. Let's look at balance. It's a little bit
earlier, right?
A little bit up, further up.
Okay. Here.
Yeah, just a little. Yeah, perfect. I thought first of all, my work, I am not a linear artist. I don't work in a linear fashion. I work in fits and bursts. I work in pieces in periods of frenetic activity and, unfortunately, paralysis and silence. Some artists work every day. That's not me. I don't work that way. The other thing is that I often start with an idea. This piece was originally, I think, flipped. In other words, the yellow front was the bottom of the piece, the way it was originally built up. And the original idea, if the piece is to become interesting, needs to be essentially destroyed. And it's sometimes a very painful process where you break through the original and you find yourself in a space over which you barely have control. I don't know if anyone has done body surfing, but it's a little bit like riding a wave. When you catch the wave, you are, it's this wonderful time. And it's a little bit the same when you manage to break through intent and you get to a new place, and each piece then becomes something new. And then this particular piece, the piece was created essentially by destroying the original form. The original form was a nice, simple form, very pretty and very boring. And then I flipped it on its side and something else happened. And then I started hacking into it. Sometimes I use a hammer and a chisel. I use stone tools. And that's often what happens, that the original intent is destroyed and something new and fresh, if I'm lucky, results.
So the process of firing clay, it's kind of involved some uncertainties. Well, and sometimes like this piece and turned out great, and I wonder if any piece come out completely disappointed you and you consider it as a failure piece, and if so, if it ever happened, how do you handle such a piece?
Absolutely, it's a great question. Well, first of all, when I was younger, I was unable to finish pieces. it took me several years before I understood that from one point of view, finishing is an act of sanity, that in a way you can spend your entire life working on one piece of sculpture or one drawing or one painting. And some people do. And as you work, you get closer and closer and closer, but it's essentially an act of madness. So finishing, you achieve a certain degree of equilibrium and then you move on. But now, in terms of your question, let's go to Cave of Light, the relief Cave of Light.
Go.
Yeah. Now, Cave of Light, I was using a new clay, a new dark clay that I had never used before. And originally it was a triptych. And in the firing, in the first firing, because all of the pieces have a two-step firing, low fire and high fire. In the first firing, one of the pieces of the triptych exploded. So I was initially very unhappy. I was very sad. I thought, terrible. And I put the two, but there was something interesting about the two pieces that remained. And I just put them aside. And I have a very poor sense of time. I've always found time inexplicable and confusing. So years passed. I have no idea how many, 4 or 5. And just at the beginning of COVID lockdown, I was in my studio and I was looking at these two pieces. And suddenly I realized, wait a second, this is a quite interesting piece. Something is there. So it needed a little bit of addition of color here and there, just to coax out the form and clarify the form. And that was it. So it was a piece that essentially died and was resurrected in a new occasionally.
Yeah, it looks great. I really love this piece. I think it's, really have its distinguished and special form here. It's great. It's it came out from life, not just died.
No, I know. Thank you. No, I like it too. Once I had finished it, I realized, wait a second, this isn't so bad.
Mm-hmm. So you have the instinct when you saw it, even though that time you were disappointed, but you feel it has something, you just didn't quite get that point at that moment. So,
Yes, there was an intuition that something was there. I mean, it's a little bit hard to talk about. I don't like talking in terms of energy, but it was more like there was plastic energy there, and it just needed to find the right configuration. And sometimes as with this piece, in essence, this piece was worked on over a 6 or 7 year period. So sometimes it takes pieces a while to develop and to come out and find themselves.
Great. I like the word energy, especially when you talk about some piece takes a longer time to develop. The
Yes.
energy stays there, and you keep add things. The energy is just involved. It's very interesting way to create works.
Yes. Wait, I saw Jim, save your question for later. I'll answer it then. But let's move on.
Next question is, we saw your primary practice is clay sculpture. In a way, it's a bit of ancient technique and art form, especially given the current fast-paced art world situation. People always do something, takes short time, they want to get it done and put it out, and your pieces sometimes take years to develop. Do you ever encounter any difficulties or ever feel frustrated, especially for takes long time and then in a slow process and such?
Well, I think I feel frustrated by the art world, as every artist does, but that's a different story. In terms of clay, people generally associate clay with pottery, and I love pottery. It's great. There are amazing potters and amazing artists, many of them, and several who I really follow and am inspired by, but I don't make pots. I've made one pot in my life, and pottery is just not my concern. My concern is sculpture using clay. Now, that said, clay is having a moment these last few years. There is in the 50s, there's an artist named Peter Volkos who he was an abstract expressionist clay sculptor, and he brought clay somewhat into the mainstream. But at the moment, clay seems to be having its moment, and I hope that will not hurt the reception of my work.
Well, let's hope so. Also, you does a lot of sculpture, but in this exhibition we have sculpture and also prints. You talked a little bit about both, but I particularly interested, like, does print also speak the same language to you as sculpture does? Do you have any preference?
Sure. So why don't you move down to the next two pieces, Adjuan? The next two reliefs, these two, yeah. And these are very recent pieces, and they are sculptures, but they are rather print-like. Especially with Time Map 2, recently someone asked, is that a print? And now let's move to the prints down below. Yeah, and the comment that many people say when they see my prints is that the prints are very sculptural. I initially didn't know about printmaking. I thought that printmaking was if you had a drawing and then you printed it, and I never thought I had anything worth printing. And in the 90s, I met the printmaker Sheila Marbane. I was introduced to her by Kathy Caraccio. There was a project that I had, and I brought it to Sheila. And Sheila took one look at it, and she said, "That's very nice." And she said, "Do you have some time? Here's a silk screen, play." And let me backtrack. Sheila was the print in the 1960s, Sheila, and 70s. Marion Goodman, who just died, had a very, very famous gallery for years. And Sheila was her printmaker during the 60s and 70s. She printed for Klaus Oldenburg, Warhol, Frankenthaler, Marisol. Then by the 90s, she was completely bored of conventional silkscreen printing, and she had developed a monotype technique, and that's when I met her. And we ended up working every week together for 2 years. And Roberta Waddell from the New York Public Library bought 5 of my prints. And during that period, I became a printmaker through Sheila, who's a great, she's not on this earth anymore, but she was a great, great spirit and a great, great printmaker. After a while, I exhausted her technique, and I started working with Shayla Goloborutko, who introduced me to this aluminum technique, which is what I now use. And it is very, very sculptural. It is essentially cutting sculpture out of aluminum. It's very percussive, it's very violent and noisy. And the aluminum plates are sculptures, which I then essentially put paint on and run through a press. So for me, the two worlds really weave in and out between each other. I have just these last few months, I finished a series of plates, and will soon be doing some more prints.
Sounds great. I really love these prints, actually. People don't like prints. Sometimes they feel it's too flat because it's mostly 2D rather than sculpture. They're more dimensional and space. But your prints really come out with spatial, and I think that's what you mostly interested in, and exploring space and timing, right?
Absolutely, yeah, space and time, yes.
I read an interview a while ago by Jonathan Goodman had with you on the Tussle magazine, he asked a question. He asked, if you see yourself as a lone wolf, uh, I think you told a very interesting story there. Could you share us the story here? And also the follow-up question is, does your perspective changed? Have your perspective changed since?
I think you're referring to the story that I recounted in Jonathan's article in Tussle, which is a great magazine. I've had many studios over the years, and this was a studio that I had at the corner of Lafayette and Prince, and it was at the very end of Soho, just before Soho became a shopping mall. There were still artists there, and I was going out for lunch one day, and there was a tour group, literally a tour group from the suburbs, and the guy who was leading and they were looking for artists. It was a tour group exploring the art world. And the guy stops me and says, "Are you an artist?" And I said, "Oh no, I'm a plumber." And I walked away. And the reason, at least in the context of the article, of Jonathan's article, I would much rather spend my time with a plumber who was a really interesting person than with a boring artist. I mean, if it's a good artist and an interesting person, that's a different story. But to quote Ellington again, if it sounds good, it is good. I'm less interested in living an artist's life than in making art. And I'm much less interested in people who call themselves artists than in people who have something to say, whatever the medium, even if it's in plumbing.
You know, it's really a fascinating, and you know, nowadays the young artists always get the advice saying, oh, they should get out, they should get as loud as possible and follow the so-called art fashion and get themselves more recognizable and like present themselves as an artist. So you know, you are a completely opposite side on this perspective, and you don't want to, you know, spend the extra energy on you know, on that. What do you think about, you know, the younger artists, this kind of situation and or so-called trend in the art world?
Well, you know, trends. There is a bridge in Paris called the Pont Neuf, the New Bridge, and it is the oldest standing bridge in Paris. So the New Bridge is the oldest one that still stands. Every artist is different. They all have to find their own way. Perhaps it is possible to come out swinging and know your path. My path has been very different. For better or for worse, it took me many years, essentially in isolation, because I didn't really want to exhibit. At a certain point, that changed, and now it's very, very important for me to show, to exhibit, to speak as I'm speaking now, and to hopefully become a part of the conversation and show my work to whoever wants to look at it. But in terms of fashion,
Difficult word.
Truman Capote, who was something of a mentor, about a poor review that he had gotten, and Gide quoted, he said, "There is an old Arab saying, the dogs bark and the caravan moves on. The fashion of the moment is like the barking dogs." And you really can't put too much store in that. And in a sense, every artist is their own caravan. They have to find their own path, regardless of the barking dogs.
I think it's a great metaphor.
Thank you.
you've been doing, this practice for a really long time. Is anything, when you talk about, prints, you mentioned about, sometimes certain technique, people will be exhaust its possibilities. You want to try something else. Is there anything you want to do in your work, but you haven't done yet?
Well, the current work I'm doing, the techniques are fairly the same, but the work, for the moment at least, excites me very much every day. So I really just want to be continuing the work that I'm doing and exploring. The one thing that of late I've been thinking about, I've always been interested in dance, although not very active lately, but I've always had a secret desire to do set design for dance. So that might be interesting to do that one day. But other than that, just to continue the work that I'm doing as best I can.
Sounds interesting. I would be very looking forward to see your dancing series.
Sounds great. If you know any company, put me in touch with them.
Okay, okay, I will keep in mind.
All right, great.
Harold, is there anything else you would like to share with us about, about your coming years or anything?
No, not really. Just that that we should all be safe and try to do the best we can in life and work, and just do the best work we can. That's all. And thanks everyone who's joined this talk. I really appreciate all your presence.
Very much, Harold, and it was really terrific. I get to know more about the work, about your stories, some interesting stories. So now we are.
And wait, Adjuan, you've been terrific. These questions that you're asking me, they're great.
Thank you very much. Now we are into the Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions to Harold, please feel free. I muted, you guys. So if anyone needed, and I will unmute everyone. So you can just start. Just give me 1 second. Mute.
Any questions?
I didn't hear you. And you hear me? No.
Yes, Aggie, I can hear you.
So I didn't hear your last question, Song. I didn't hear what you just asked.
Oh, I said that, now, if you have any question to Harold, you can ask him now.
We can do what?
Ask questions to Harold.
It's a question and answer time now. Anyone who wants to ask me questions.
Oh,
no one has to, but if anyone wants to ask questions, I'm here.
Here's a question in the group chat. It's from Jim Kennedy. He asked why Cave of Light and not the resurrection.
Okay. Well, okay, let's go back. Let's look at the piece.
Okay.
It's a great question, Jim. A little theological, and I suppose my description merited that. Let's go to Cave of Light.
I was following up on your resurrecting the piece from its death.
Yes, of course. I know that. I know that, and I appreciate it. Nice to hear your voice, Jim.
You as well. It's great to see you, Harold.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Well, the resurrection part was really normally I wouldn't have talked about that because that was more in response to Adjuan's question, and it just, I guess by the time the piece was done, I had forgotten about the part of it that had been lost, and it had become something new, and I was essentially responding to it in the present. And yes. Usually, as I mentioned, I think before, my take on titles rarely come to me during the work process. But afterwards, when the piece is finished, usually something will suggest itself. And for whatever reason, this piece, the words came to me, Cave of Light. I don't know why. I'm not sure if that's an answer, but that's it.
Well, I can certainly understand the title because there's so much movement in this piece.
Yeah.
It's almost like as you look at it, you think of a cave and it makes me want to go into the cave and see what's there because
Well,
it
thank you. Thank you very much, Jim.
has a lot
Yeah.
of movement. It's incredible.
Thank you. Thank you.
Harold, it's Phyllis Solomon.
Yes, hi, Phyllis.
How do you start off if the piece keeps changing as you're working on it? How do you get your original idea? It's sort of so interesting to me. I'm used to more realistic paintings. They see something and they try to draw it, but you seem to be changing as you keep going. I find that very interesting.
Well, this is a little hard to talk in words, but because I work in essentially the forms, the finished form is the final result of, call it a dance in space. It's you start with an initial plastic idea. I'm very disinterested I am not a conceptual artist. The ideas that I work with are very limited. Sometimes there are a few ideas, but what interests me is the visual result. How I get there is up to me, but how I get there is it's a kind of, if you call it a dance in space, and the form is the final result. It's not a very helpful answer, probably.
No, but I love that.
The other thing that I want to say is that the most important thing is to work in the totality rather than incrementally. The difference for me between illustration and, for want of a better word, true art, although that's pretty much highfalutin and a little bit crazy term, is that an illustrator will work incrementally. You put a little piece there, you add this, you add that, and you hope that it adds up. The only problem is that any piece of art, whether if you put down a color, suddenly the whole changes. If you make a mark here and a mark there, the reality of the whole has changed. So you're always working on a moving canvas. That's just the way it is.
I love that concept, dance in space. I love that. It's beautiful.
Well, thank you. Thank you. But the key is that the form is the result. It's not, you don't begin with the form, you end with it.
Yes.
We have a guest want to ask question.
Harold, can you hear
Yes, Agi?
You hear me?
Yes, very well.
You know what you're doing? You're
No.
expressing quantum physics.
Thank you, but
That's exactly what is happening. The understanding of humans. It is the quantum physics which you start when you read about it. You dance in these images of energy, space, and time. If you read those books, it's what you're doing.
thank you. I have to admit, I'm not, I mean, I don't know very much about quantum physics.
Not
It's
that even the physicists don't know much about it, but when they pick it and describe it, they wind up in that energy, which I can feel when every piece of work you do.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I've often thought that there is much less of a difference than people think between science and art.
Exactly what I say.
That the language, the specific language is different, whether it be the language of the words of literature or music or dance or sculpture or painting, but the pursuit on the highest level is not so different.
That's right.
Thank you.
It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Love it. Swimming in space and time.
Series now.
Harold, what impresses me is the continuity of your work. There is a line from I knew your work a long time ago, and I
Yes.
can see the continuation, but there is always something new that comes in. You know, it's kind of striking. And the work to me, if I would have to describe it to someone who doesn't know work, I would say there is always something mysterious in your work.
Thank you.
You find your way through things, you know, and it's very fascinating, I must say.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great compliment. I mean, that's what one aspires to. We try, one tries.
Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, we have one just joined us. To give you a little bit background, right now we're in the Q&A session. So if you have any questions to our artist Harold, please feel free to ask.
Hi, I typed the question in the chat, but I guess I'll just.
Oh, okay. So I can, yeah, you can repeat it, or I can.
Yeah, I'm very impressed with the work. Also, Mr. Watcher, say hi to you. I just want to relay that to you, Mr. Wortsman.
Hello.
What was the spark or moment that prompted you to want to show your art more and become less private?
It was a gradual development. I think it started about 10 years ago. It just, I mean, I've never wanted not to show. It just wasn't yet the time. And then it gradually became time. I can't say why. It just was time. And now it's a great need. As important as it is for me to make the work, it is important to show it. And that was not the case before. And I've no idea why. It just is the case now. It's not much of an answer, but it's really all I can say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jerry Wayne, he wrote another question, but I will repeat it. He says, please say more about controlled randomness and intense in the enemy. Harold, you comment on that?
Say that again. Can you read it again? Controlled randomness and
intent is the enemy.
Oh, intent. Yes, yes, yes. What I mean is that intent is ego. And sometimes you see the work of an artist and it's just their ego talking. Whereas sometimes much of the great art, I mean, of course, every artist has an ego. I'm not talking about that. But the work itself, it's completely disinterested who made it. It's the work itself that needs to speak. And in terms of intent, it's a little bit, as I tried to express before, the pieces often begin with a certain intentionality. But by this point, I've done this long enough that I know that it's a trick and that the intentionality is the thing that is to be fought against. The intentionality is just the first step. It's the easy first step. I mean, I have, you know, we all do the things that we have a rudimentary talent for. I have a certain talent for working in clay, which is why I do it. But at the same time, that initial talent or that initial simple form is boring and is simple. And then the whole point is breaking through and getting through to a point where you're not quite in control of things and where you're in a new space. And that's where stuff gets interesting. That's where the story, the image, the music, the form becomes interesting, when you're in a new space, a new room that you've never been in before.
Mhm.
I hope that's an answer.
Okay, great. Okay, anyone?
I just have one question. For so many artists, and I think musicians and actors in particular, the pandemic has been something that is extraordinarily frustrating and prevents those artists, in a sense, from presenting their art. And as we're sitting here today, and particularly seeing, Harold, photographs of your sculptures, or even internet images of your remarkable prints, I realized that although you could sit in your studio and make art, you're also not getting the opportunity to show your art in the way in which it would be showed in a non-pandemic environment. And I just wonder what effect that's had on you, whether it's been frustrating or a source of inspiration to do more. But my own heart aches for musician friends that I have and so forth, and other artists, because of the effect of the pandemic. And I just wonder how that's affected you as an artist.
No, it's a good question, Jim. I've spoken to a few artist friends and in different media, and it's funny because a lot of us, maybe people of all media, of all professions, the first couple of months of lockdown, I mean, aside from the terror of sickness, we were all afraid. It was pre-vaccine. Everyone was terrified not to get sick. But the period of lockdown, the first few months, were actually kind of neat. Suddenly there was no distraction. Suddenly I basically all I could do was work in the studio. And so that was a relatively productive time. Then it started to get kind of depressing, and one felt really quite isolated. And then the vaccines came and things started to open up. And this year has really begun really great for me. I mean, I'm very grateful to Orange Art for this exhibition. There's some other things coming around the bend in the future. And this event now is wonderful. Sure, the complete lack of brick and mortar has been a problem. I mean, I suppose the only saving grace is that it's affected everyone. Nobody, we couldn't, everyone has been affected equally. So from that point of view, we're just taking a break. But the things like this are quite wonderful and are putting us in touch with the world at large. So it's just a question of being a little more patient, hopefully, till things open up again. I hope that's an answer, Jim.
Oh, absolutely, it is. And I would I look forward to the day when we can walk around a room and see your pieces. I really do.
Thank you. Me too. Me too. I think that's a great request for this coming year.
Yes. Yes.
I agree.
We are looking forward to it. Oh, I will read a message from Leonardo sorry.
Leonard Seastone.
Seastone, okay. He said, thank you for this forum. It is a good place to meet with your work, Harold, and your words help in amplification of the work. So
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Leonard. But again, the seditious part of me perhaps wants to end the way that I began, to quote Matisse, that an artist has to cut out their tongue. And it's really about you all looking at the work and seeing it in whatever fashion you can.
Finally create a memorial to Anne on the place where we think that her body must be.
TV.
Thus, it's a fairly modest
Wait, there's background sound.
It looms so large in English history.
Someone please turn off whatever your background is.
Okay. Yeah, someone has a TV on. Okay. Okay, great. So I will say a little bit of word on Tom Chan's question about why Harold want to show more work right now. Harold already answered the question, but I just want to add a little bit something. I think for artists, there's certain period focus on different things. It's not only artists, we all have different focus and different stage of life. And though most artists are considered as a lone wolf, because art work and the creation of art is a kind of a transformation of energy, and energy needs certain circulation. One of course could keep working, keep creating, but at a certain stage it's important to exchange energy with the audience or whoever see the work, whatever feedback is. I think it's important to have that kind of gaze and exchange of energy. It's a part of everything of our life. I think it's important. Okay. Okay, great. So, Hara, do you want to add something?
I just really want to say thank you. First, thank you, Adjuan, to you for hosting this. Thank you to you and Orange Art for hosting this great exhibition. These were wonderful questions, and thank you for everyone who has joined the event and come and looked. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for again to join us tonight. It is really wonderful, and hopefully even outside is snow beautifully, and we stay well. And I want to use this opportunity to thank Jonathan Goodman. He's art critique writer and who wrote the article for this exhibition. And you can see the full article on our website, and the exhibition will be on view through March 13th. So you can always go back to our website to check on the work. And if you have more questions, feel free to send us a message or emails. And I hope you all are enjoying the wonderful weekend.
Adjuan, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All of you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful.